Welcome to this afternoon's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website and sent to those who registered for the event. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please submit your questions through the Q&A box below. With that, over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Adam. I'm Matthew Wallin. I'm the COO of the American Security Project. I'm happy to be here and discussing this event with our esteemed guests. The last 20 years have seen a great deal of innovation in the field of digital diplomacy. The introduction of modern social networks at the turn of the century saw a significant lag time in the adoption of those tools by governments. But this was followed in the late 2000s by a full-fledged embrace of those technologies and an urgency in the need for governments to catch up. By 2016, we witnessed an emerging reckoning around the limits of digital networks and the challenges they present, but by late 2020, we were all zoomed out. We have seen the power of social media and digital diplomacy to unite, to divide, to bring hope, and to bring despair. Today, in the shadow of Russia's war in Ukraine, we take a look at the landscape that digital diplomacy is helping to shape, as countries and people chart their way forward in the pursuit of peace, and also in support of national objectives that are not always so benign. To help us scope out what that landscape looks like and to get a better understanding of the lessons and strategies learned by both governments and people, we have Macon Phillips and Gerry Diaz Bartolome, two key pathfinders and adopters of digital diplomacy who know the digital terrain well. I will not get into biographies. Those were available on the website. So we're just going to get right into questions in the limited time we have. Of course, there is a Q&A box, as Adam mentioned earlier. Please feel free to submit your Q&As throughout the presentation, and we hope to get to them. So let's jump right into it. Gentlemen, the very idea behind social media and many of the tools in the digital diplomacy realm was the concept of decentralizing and democratizing communication. These tools have given regular people the same tools as governments to reach an audience. In many cases, you could probably argue that these tools actually give people more power than states might actually have in terms of this communication. So in this, and keeping that in mind, have states gotten any better at commanding attention and influence online when the cyberspace is essentially so crowded with voices?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to find Macon back again. We had the chance to work together during my years in Washington, D.C. It's a big pleasure. Thank you very much, American Security Project, for allowing me this opportunity. Just a disclaimer, I'm speaking here in my personal capacity, and none of my opinions can be taken as that of the Argentine government. Well, actually, Matthew, what you've just asked, I fully agree. Digital diplomacy has certainly democratized diplomacy. It's accessible to many actors, not only states. And it has forced governments to a new way of communication because it's more horizontal. It's meant to not just to disseminate information from a top to bottom channeling of official press releases, but it's meant to engage with different audiences, and audiences go far beyond the official counterparts. So it has certainly brought up a level of same level of playing field, as you said, and including non-state actors and individuals. In my personal experience, I had because of the COVID outbreak, I was in Washington by then, and we had to basically transform the whole operation of the embassy to go digital. And that opened up a new sphere, not only interacting with our usual counterparts, but with actual people. So that's a challenge. Not everybody's ready to engage from a diplomatic point of view because it demands, some mastering of the messages you need to convey and how to react and how to actually engage online with people that are, again, not the usual counterparts for a diplomat.
Yeah, and let me just pick up on that. And Gerry, it is wonderful to be back with you. And we were joking before the event started. It's been a quiet, few years since we last were together, but lots to talk about. And I also want to thank Matthew and the American Security Project for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited for this event. And it's great questions to kick things off. So, I will say, to what extent, or to the question, how has technology democratized diplomacy? What has its impact been on information and diplomacy overall? I think that it's actually not as clear as I felt it was when I worked at the State Department. The last few years, I think, have taught us a lot about the myth of democratizing information in the face of how corporations and social media companies have shaped how information flows through the platforms that we use. Of course, Meta, which owns Facebook, Twitter, all of these platforms that are so central to the conversation that we have are now seen in a much clearer sense for more than just simply democratic systems. And I think it's important to understand that. Certainly having come out of the recent election in the United States and seeing the politics here domestically, I'm quite weary, or wary, I should say, of calling this a democratic issue. What I would say instead is, rather than talk about the democratization of diplomacy, I think we should think about the decentralization of diplomacy and the fact that what used to be simple systems, what used to be, as I used to joke when I worked at State, a lot of guys in suits talking to other guys in suits, it's changing, and they aren't even meeting in rooms anymore. There are many other stakeholders involved in the process now, and what used to be fairly simple in the days of, say, George Kennan is quite multifaceted, quite multi-stakeholder, and increasingly complex. And that's all along the sort of mega trend of decentralization, which I think social media and other technological trends in the last few years have only accelerated. And I think that's the sort of principal challenge right now as we consider how diplomatic institutions can adapt and be successful in 2022.
Now, Macon, you bring up a couple of things there that are really interesting, particularly the roles of some of these private companies, whether they be Meta / Facebook or Alphabet / Google or even Twitter, and the role that they are playing, partially as the decentralizers themselves, but also centralizing where the communication is happening online, and their ability to turn on or off a government's or an individual's ability to communicate. And not to get too deep into politics, but if we look at something like when Donald Trump's Twitter account was banned versus some calls on whether or not, say, the Iranian supreme leader's Twitter account should be banned. I mean, what role are these companies playing in terms of moderating diplomacy?
They're playing a huge role. But I think it's actually less, at least in the United States, the First Amendment and I think the healthy capitalistic and sort of private sector that we have works to simplify this issue to some extent. It's up to Twitter if they want to kick Trump off their platform. I've always thought of Twitter as a company just like someone who owns a bar. And if someone comes to your bar and is unruly and harassing everyone, you can kick them out. That you don't need to call the mayor to tell them that you have rights to be there. I mean, this is a private enterprise. And I think similarly, it's up to Facebook and other private companies to make these choices about who they allow on their platforms. It's also really important that the US government is quite intentional and careful about how it tries to influence those decisions, if at all. So I think those are sort of platform by platform, but you absolutely are correct that deplatforming has a huge impact. And there was a lot of hand-wringing about what to do about Trump and all the stuff. And what we found is once you took his megaphone away, it really affected his power. And now he's scrambling to try to rebuild that power with his own company that he apparently hasn't even really posted to and doesn't seem to be enjoying so much. And so it'll be interesting to see how he finds a new perch from which to communicate without his access to Twitter. That's entirely a private sector issue, I think.
But when a state leader, is deplatformed, does that affect the way they're able to conduct what we would think of as traditional diplomacy overseas. If overseas leaders are reacting to tweets or Facebook posts or whatever they may be, this stuff that is disseminated digitally, and they're no longer to do that. I mean, does that have a major effect, or is it just, well, it's just not as public, we're still continuing with the same issues?
I think that there's a difference between the ability of an individual to grab a device and hammer out a message and hit enter, and it sort of asymmetrically go to a cajillion people overnight, or in a second for that matter, versus the ability for someone to act and their actions move around the world very quickly. I mean, just take a look at North Korea today. So like there's, I think, a world that is hyper wired, hyper connected, very paying attention to the utterances of leaders. And those will move if those are consequential, they will move whether or not. But it gets back to the platforms in the sense that to the extent leaders know how to manipulate the algorithms of these private sector companies, they can get, I think, a lot of benefit that they may not deserve. But I find the sort of idea that private companies are censoring leaders to really give private companies a little too much power. On the other hand, it's important to understand that even Facebook itself has admitted that the direction that these things are going are into increasingly smaller, closed and private groups. So what used to be happening on a Facebook page is now happening in WhatsApp groups. We're seeing the rise of Signal. We're seeing certainly in Web3 rise of new technologies. And I think the conversation in 5 years is going to be very different than it was 5 years ago, in the sense that these networks are a lot less centralized than they used to be. And as a result, it's going to be a lot more difficult for any one actor to be muzzled.
Gerry, in your experience, do you find that there are ways in which individuals, groups, or states either excel or perhaps don't do as well in digital diplomacy? Where are the strengths for these different groups? Are there certain things that some do better than others?
Yeah, I will first, if you allow me, pick up on something like
Sure.
just because I actually see this as very much related to the big issues of misinformation and all this dark side, as it is called by scholars, dark side of digital diplomacy. And governments have been reacting to this too. It's a challenge, and it has led many ministries of foreign affairs to come up with strategic units for communication. And even international organizations, there's actually a huge campaign going on with the Pledge to Pause by the United Nations, asking people, followers, to first think about what they will post before going ahead or retweeting something which might be provocative or actually wrong, misinformed. I think digital diplomacy opens up a huge variety. I'm very pro digital diplomacy. And so because I support that so much, I think we need to be careful on certain things. And as diplomats, we besides convey our government's positions, unless we do it on a private capacity. So we need to be extremely careful what we post, how we post it, how we phrase it, the narratives that governments have, and as individuals, we sort of have the same responsibility, even if acting, again, in our personal capacity. Digital diplomacy is very positive. Decentralization is a very good word. It captures actually the same meaning I tried to convey when I mentioned the democratization process, because it opens up the same scenario, the blogosphere for everyone wanting to join. It decentralizes communication even within governments, because now it allows some other officers from other ministries to join conversations abroad without having to actually travel to the site, to the venue of the meeting taking place. And the main thing brought about by COVID, if I can say so, a positive side effect of the pandemic, is that it opened up digital diplomacy beyond public diplomacy. It has gone into the traditional fields of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. As I see it, the stage we're going through now is trying to strike a reasonable, sound balance between both worlds, virtual and in person, and make the best of both. Because now, actually, I am working with my colleagues in Geneva, in New York, in Paris, in this new format of hybrid diplomacy, as it is called. which works well, but not for every function we diplomats are expected to carry out. Negotiations is usually mentioned as the most sensitive field where digital diplomacy may get complicated because of, the lack of personal feel, the difficulty to read a room or to have a chat in a corridor where you end up sometimes agreeing on certain things that you cannot do formally in the room. So that's how I see it. And that also applies to actors, non-state actors and individuals, civil society, NGOs. They are now fully empowered to take part in the conversation. And we governments know that and are open to exchanging views with them, including our own nationals while we are abroad. The so-called diaspora diplomacy. It is not that it did not exist before COVID, but COVID proved how useful digital diplomacy can be to reach out our own nationals while you're abroad. And in times of crisis, these proved actually very, very fruitful.
It's interesting that you bring up the case of non-state actors and their ability to sort of participate in the process, but not only in the process of diplomacy, but also sort of in the pressure that goes behind it, in the function of it. If we look at the role of, say, hacktivists or anonymous, and if we turn to like what's going on in Ukraine right now, these entities, these individuals, these loose groups of individuals are having a major impact in terms of their own forms of sanctions enforcement. Do you see that role growing over time? Do you see countries thinking about this as they engage in these public forums, not necessarily aimed at public, but these public forms of diplomacy? Does the willingness of these non-state actors to participate or fight against it, factor into how countries conduct diplomacy digitally?
Well, we as diplomats deal with official counterparts, so that we do not actually engage with those kind of actors. And when we do public diplomacy, it is either cultural diplomacy or trade diplomacy. We're not. We have our official channels to deal with these specific examples you've just mentioned. It's not the usual way we deal with that. But we cannot, ignore that there are many non-state actors in space and interacting with governments. That's a fact. And as far as the situation in Ukraine is concerned, well, beyond my government's position, which is well known and public, both sides are using and resorting to digital diplomacy as a means to communicate, to disseminate information and unity judgment. And actually, most of the bilateral meetings have taken place digitally on virtual platforms.
Now, I want to touch a little bit on COVID because it's been brought up a couple of times, and obviously it's had a major impact on the world of digital communication, how we use digital communication, of course, and how diplomacy is conducted. We're seeing more, high state-to-state level meetings conducted digitally rather than in person. But I'm wondering if either of you or both of you can comment sort of more on what we've learned digitally or in terms of digital diplomacy as a result of the COVID pandemic. We were discussing this beforehand. I found it quite worrying when it started that we weren't going to be able to shift to this whole online work environment, and almost every organization has managed to do that. States have done it, organizations, companies. Even the restaurant industry, to an extent, has managed this shift. But have we gotten sick of it? Have we found the limits of what it can do and how it can be used? Are we yearning for that in-person interaction again?
The
obvious answer to that is yes.
I feel like you were saying as much as asking in that question, yeah, Matthew, yeah, get out. It's okay, man. Yeah. No, it is true. It's really lonely. I think the last 2 years at times have been really lonely for a lot of people. And certainly for me, I think I love being around people. When I worked at the State Department, I worked in a bureau of incredibly interesting people who loved learning about the world and had traveled. And then I got to meet people like Gerry, and I got to go around the world, and it was incredible. So absolutely the in-person matters. But I also, one of the most incredible experiences I had in my career was working on the Obama presidential campaign. And the big takeaway from me there is this idea of like digital versus real world is a false choice. It's just a false choice. The real world is the digital world and vice versa. We have to look at these things as how they complement one another, how they make us work smarter. You know, if you can save, if you can find the 10 people to meet in real life by being able to initially engage 100,000 people, like, great. You know, we used to use data and online organizing to make the door knocking in neighborhoods more effective. I mean, it was really about marrying the sort of two dimensions. And frankly, when I worked there, and this is, you know, years ago now, I always, and maybe this is just me, but I always felt like the sort of like incumbent power centers in the institutions talked about digital almost in a like patronizing way, right? Like it was almost like, okay, like these are like, it was code for disruption. It was code for a new culture. It was code for a lot of things that were not the way things had historically worked. And I think when you get down to it, a lot of what digital represents is change, and change is difficult. But if to come back to your initial question, I think what the pandemic did was accelerate a lot of these changes. And we are now incredibly comfortable jumping on Zoom and chatting. And I got to say, like, when I worked at State, there were just rooms where you would go to have a video conference, and it was like a thing. You had to book it, and the tech was terrible, and you would do a thing and whatever. And now people are just doing video conferencing at their desk with non-state people. And this is a very basic idea, but it's a game changer. The tyranny of geography was always something that shaped diplomacy, and that has been abstracted. Some countries have the access, don't have the tech that they need, and so forth. But as a general measure, the ability to spin up a Zoom and talk to someone like Gerry from DC, and he's in Buenos Aires, is, I mean, why isn't the diplomatic community overjoyed about this, right? Now, it shouldn't replace in person, but at the same time, like, it seems like an incredible enhancement to the relationship building that is the centerpiece of diplomacy. So I'm really bullish on this trend, and I think it's going to be it's not going back. There's not a return to normalcy here. This isn't the new normal, and we just need to figure out how to make it work for us.
Gerry, maybe you can expand on that a little bit. I know you've written on the idea of hybrid diplomacy and finding that right balance. And this echoes one of the questions that we have in the chat about knowing when it is right to use these digital tools versus the in-person tools, and you know, what it is that we either miss or don't miss by using these tools. What are we missing in person, or you know, what is it that we're longing for in these interactions?
I definitely have a follow-up on this, Gerry. So when you're done.
You couldn't have said it better in better terms. I can't agree more with you. I totally agree. Hybrid is the way to go. It's here to stay. Absolutely, the COVID pandemic has catalyzed, accelerated trends that existed before to a completely unforeseen degree. And overnight, all of a sudden, most of us were not that prepared. Not Macon's case, because he's an expert, but in our case, we had to learn overnight. Scholars speak about the process of adaptation versus adoption in theoretical terms. So to describe the process we diplomats had to go through during the pandemic, adapting ourselves, adapting our behavior to digital tools and digital language, and vis-a-vis the adoption process, which is a more internal reflective process within ministries of foreign affairs, within the State Department, to come up with solutions and digital disruption in a positive way. But as I see it, of course, the very fact that we had to migrate all of a sudden the whole of our activities online enhanced and put in real value the face-to-face business diplomacy is all about. And actually, we do have to combine both worlds and leave face-to-face diplomacy and give it the real value it has. There's no way for us to build up trust online unless you know the other person. There's no way for us diplomats to read a room, even if we are sharing a screen with hundreds of small boxes in a mosaic format. Yeah, there's no way for us to see the gestures, to have, as I was saying, the chat in the corridor, or a coffee at 3 a.m. in the morning. I've written a lot about this because, you know, I was at the UN before. I worked, I was posted to our mission to the United Nations years back, and most of the agreements were reached over a coffee, sometimes 2, 3 a.m.
Right.
outside the main room. And that empathy, that relationship you build with your colleagues, it's very hard to build online. If you know the people beforehand, as I know Macon, it could be easier because there's something in the air. But starting when you're sent back to square one, start anew, it's not that easy. And again, most of our functions, we had to perform them online because we had no choice. We couldn't choose. Now that we have the option, we are trying to grasp which ones are best suited online and which ones are better performed in person. As I see it, preparatory meetings, internal staff meetings, all those, even bilateral meetings that do not have a substance of negotiation involved can be certainly done online. You save money, you save time, you can bring more people into the conversation. It's very useful. But there are certain instances where you do need the personal touch. You do need meet face to face. And sometimes even confidentiality is a big issue. Sometimes you cannot trust, however trustworthy the system or the platform can be, you need to connect personally. Sometimes in the sidelines, and there's no way for us to do that online. Not because there are always huge state secrets involved. Sometimes it's part of the negotiation, of the exchange, of the bargaining of the negotiation. You cannot do that online.
Do you find almost that because the Zoom conversations are almost so structured or so defined, you know, I'm taking time out of my day to get on Zoom to do this thing, and I've got this much time to do it, that you actually find that you have less time to sort of have those side conversations or get to know the person personally because it's all business, versus something that might actually take longer that you've scheduled more time for, but you can get more done because you have that side time involved?
Yeah, actually Zoom is more time saving, but as far as results are concerned, it's not as efficient. Zoom or whichever other platform. And the issue is not to Zoom or not to Zoom, as scholars have just written, some friends of mine from Oxford, in a very interesting article. It's not Zoom or not to Zoom, it's when to Zoom. You need to find a way, when is it proper to Zoom, to make a meeting, and then you go on with the next phase. But there's always a need to do, diplomacy is a face-to-face business. There's no way it can replace it. The challenge is to combine, and as Macon was saying, to make the most of both worlds and empower one with the other and vice versa.
Macon, you had a follow-up that you wanted to.
Oh boy, yeah, lots of feelings here, and I'm paying attention to the chat as well, and I think there's some really interesting comments there. But I think, oh boy, well, I'll just say two things here to build on Gerry's points, and I definitely, I'll have to admit, I tend to shy away from, you know, the viewpoint, which is widely shared, you know, that you know, face-to-face is the best. And you know, I think it's sort of different cases, you know, sometimes the people you really need to meet can't be with you face-to-face. I think that this idea that we're expanding accessibility through technology is really important. And that I think I also have a bias towards public diplomacy being, frankly, more important than traditional diplomacy, because it's sort of the point for democratic institutions, and that's a whole other conversation. But like, to me, like the 2 points I wanted to make here, one, I think some of the themes that you hear are about trust and about how to build trust. And I think it is the case that it is easier to build trust in person than online when you don't know the person, right? But it is also quite useful to continue to maintain and increase trust over time using digital relationships built on perhaps that in-person meeting. And I think where you see an enormous example of this is in exchange programs. And I think some of the opportunities for exchange programs, one of the biggest lessons I took away from my time at the State Department is that $1 billion Americans invest every year in exchanges is far too little because they are incredibly high impact experiences that pay dividends in the short and long term. And I'm sure this group here understands the argument for that. But where we don't do a good job, and where I feel like there's huge opportunities, is maximizing the return on that investment over time. You come here for a face-to-face experience here to the United States and you go home. We kind of don't have the ongoing relationship management from an online perspective that one would hope you would have if you spend $1 billion on something every year. And that is a huge opportunity for digital engagement, that there are examples of where state, I think, has really done a good job, but it's enormous opportunity overall. So I think that's one, is sort of this idea of how trust works. But yeah, the second piece, and I said at the top, is really looking at the voices in the room. And to the extent diplomacy is hampered by a lack of diversity, is hampered by a lack of bringing in all the right stakeholders to conversations, digital diplomacy, I think it can be a really useful channel to expand that conversation. And I think that's a generally understood challenge for the way things have been working and what we need to work on moving forward.
Great. And Macon, you bring up a number of things, and it's a perfect segue. And by the way, I want to remind the audience, if you do have questions you want to submit, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But the subject of exchanges is really interesting in this field, because as you've mentioned, there's a lot of value behind traditional exchanges. There's a lot of expense behind that as well, but there's also limited ability to reach that sort of drop in the bucket. You can only bring so many people in the country to participate in these programs, but digital gives you the ability to reach potentially much larger audiences. We're talking, in the ranges of hundreds of thousands of sometimes. So Macon, given that you've sort of discussed that there really is no barrier between, the analog and the digital, when you're hosting a digital exchange program, how does that translate into real world action or feeling or sentiment?
So I think that there's sort of two main trends or two main directions. I think first would be informing and mobilizing people. So it's a lot easier to look at this in sort of the domestic political context. I think we see a lot of innovation in American political campaigns that it's hard for the State Department to get its head around, because they don't want to necessarily organize and run campaigns in other countries. That's not exactly how diplomacy should work. And yet a lot of the outcomes and sort of making people feel like they're part of something and really helping be effective at social media, comes from that sense of common purpose, comes from that sense of we're joining together to work on something. We're joining together to fight climate change, or call out Putin on invading Ukraine, or whatever the sort of common cause is. And that idea of common cause, I think, is really key as we think about public diplomacy. And so this is challenging. Is it the case that the State Department is going to build an email list and email a lot of people and get them to do stuff in another country? I think there we see it's much more informing them, making sure that they have credible channels on what the US government's thinking, making sure that we're kind of fighting the information war, if you will, through those direct channels. The second piece where I see a lot of change, and this would be, with the Young African Leaders Initiative, with various exchange programs that we've seen in countries, is using diplomacy as a catalyst to create communities among audiences. So to come for the experience with diplomacy, stay for the relationships and the people you meet in the process. And so when I would travel, even to places like Argentina, I would routinely meet with young entrepreneurs, people who cared about climate issues, people who cared about different cultural issues, and they wouldn't know each other, but our embassy would have invited them all to an event to meet me, the guy who set up Obama's MySpace page or whatever. And to me, the thing that was most impactful was the fact that I was leaving Argentina having connected people with each other because the United States had been there. And that felt like the way change and impact can work in public diplomacy in a way that both countries can be excited about.
Let's talk a little bit about the idea of listening. One of the advantages of digital is that two-way communication that it provides that you don't get out of standard broadcast media in most cases. One thing that's always struck me is sort of discerning between the validity of the feedback that you're getting online versus the amount of feedback that you're getting versus sort of the type. So you've got the problem of all the comment feeds of almost anything you post being full of racist, misogynist, and other garbage. And you've got the value of a like on a Facebook post. What does that mean? Versus the amount of astroturfing and then the 20,000 comments that you might receive. And in the mix of that, there's some legitimate opinion. So have we gotten any better over the last 10 years at listening to people online, sort of digesting what's valid and what's not, and sort of tackling the issue of like the sheer volume of it that we're receiving?
If you allow me, Macon has just referred to a very important aspect of exchange programs, and which is the function of listening. Scholars on public diplomacy have a taxonomy. Actually, Nick Cole, who we're talking about him, has one of the specific functions of public diplomacy is to enhance the function of listening. It's not only disseminating information, but engaging, but listening. And again, the exchange programs are like the tool of public diplomacy. It honors all the tenets of public diplomacy and people-to-people diplomacy, and the pandemic had a devastating effect on that. But one of the positive aspects, because of the forced virtual exchange programs, because there was no other alternative, was that the function of listening was very much enhanced, because people got online to listen to each other. They were gathered around a very common topic, and most of them were facing the same sad circumstances during COVID. So there was something in common, and people actually listened to one another. That was brought about by the pandemic as a very positive effect in public diplomacy. As far as social media is concerned, Matthew, the question of liking or not liking a tweet may have very consequential, consequences, I would say, and but people listen and react, and that's positive. Even if it is an issue which you should combat because it's garbage, as you said, you still listen and you need to combat and act accordingly. So that is the very essence of public diplomacy, actually. And going back to the exchanges, Macon was referring to the issue of the benefits after the exchange actually took place. As I see it, it relates to a very important concept that the US government is very much aware of, which is leadership. When you select the people you are bringing to your country to go through a very rich process of acculturation and immersion in your culture, you're spotting prospective leaders. And it's an investment, because those leaders, young leaders, will carry the seed of affection, of respect, they will understand and grasp the very importance the other government attaches to certain values, which they will bring back home. So that is how it works. Maybe you don't reap the rewards in a couple of years, but it's I would say a medium to long-term investment, which is really fruitful. And part of it has to do with the ability those young leaders have to listen to what you have to convey while they are living in your culture.
Macon, thoughts?
Well, I think that, yeah, a lot in there. I would, one thing to respond is this idea of listening as part of public diplomacy, and 100%. And again, the sort of experience I had working in digital a few years ago inside these institutions was oftentimes running into the more cowbell attitude towards digital where people wanted to know how many retweets did our post to get, as if, diplomacy should be measured by the extent to which your sycophants share your propaganda with their own networks. That seems like a fairly narrow view. And I'm all for people spreading the good word, but let's face it, the State Department at least, and Gerry, I would assume the ministry there, is fundamentally a reporting organization. You have incredibly smart, savvy people that are out there talking to people like regular diplomacy, real diplomacy, and they're developing relationships with other people in suits or, titans of industry or media types and traditional power centers, and sort of learning about things and then writing cables. And then writing cables and writing cables and writing cables. And then those are fed back into the mothership, and the mothership sort of, determines what the policy is based on this reporting. And it's a really fascinating mechanism, right? It's really about understanding and listening. That is the DNA of how these diplomatic institutions work. And yet, when it comes to perhaps the greatest opportunity to send to a broad variety of perspectives, we just wanted to be louder and sort of get our good word out there and understand how we could have more cowbell. And the best advice I ever heard on this was from an ambassador at State who, quickly, he was at the time the ambassador in Poland, and he really went to his fellow ambassadors with his personal plea for the use of social media and said, listen, I have a Twitter account, and this is why I think it's valuable. First, I'm on it all the time because I follow reporters, other influencers in Poland, because it has better news and faster news than anything I'm getting on my daily clips from the State Department or the front page of the newspaper. If you aren't following the news in a country through social media, in addition to all your other sources, you aren't doing your job. All right. Two, I answer questions on Twitter, and to the extent I get interviewed by reporters, I never am really surprised by what they're going to ask me because I'm already seeing those questions coming at me on social media. People ask much more direct, much more topical and challenging questions on social media than I ever get from reporters. The third is I'm able to understand the cultural idioms and sort of emerging language. Like my Polish is better because I'm on social media. I am able to actually speak in the vernacular of people in this country. None of those three had anything to do with content he created and put out on social. I just felt like that was a profoundly important point. So this idea that listening is sort of the base of public diplomacy is lost, I think, when we start looking at digital diplomacy, and it's something we need to bring back to the fore.
Well, we've got just a minute or two left here, so I just want to sort of throw it out and see if you guys have any thoughts on sort of your hopes or fears for digital diplomacy in the future. I mean, for me, one thing that comes to mind is, the idea of deep fakes. But at the same time, I'm also inspired by the amount of unity that's forming online around dealing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, I mean, do you have sort of hopes or fears, or what are you looking forward to or worried about in this field over the next few years?
I'll give you one specific fear that yeah, I mean, there are phenomena in countries where the information space has really, what's the right word? Well, I mean, I see a question right now about Myanmar, and it's a great example. There's also the Philippines. I think maybe Colombia is sort of in this, but where you have this explosion of conversation and information that's all running on top of Facebook, in part because of zero rating that makes it incredibly cheap to access Facebook for a lot of populations that would otherwise not be able to afford data plans, right? They get, would you rather pay to have access to the open internet, or would you rather have Facebook for free? And it's a devil's bargain that I feel like is moving a lot of populations into this like pseudo open internet that actually still runs on corporate internet. That's really problematic. So I'm worried about where that goes, because as much as I support individual corporations' decisions and the consequences that come with those. At the same time, to your earlier point, Matthew, it's a lot of power for a company to have if that's where everything is. When we look back at the US, for as much as we worry about the effect of social media on our elections, and it was significant, we still have quite a diversity of information sources, and we should be very thankful for that. But a lot of countries, I feel like, have really consolidated on these, and those are the ones that I worry about the most. That's my one. I'm happy to throw out some others too.
And your thoughts, Gerry, as we wrap up?
I am very optimistic. Actually, I have more wishes than fears. Fears have been appearing in our conversation. Misinformation is a huge thing. Fake news is another big issue. But we are struggling to come up with mechanisms to deal with those. But there are many hopes. I think this opens up, digital diplomacy opens up a new world to many countries. We cannot ignore the digital divide for sure that there exists in the world. So we need to cope with that too. But in the end, it's very positive because it allows many of my colleagues to be part of conversations that they were not able before. Even within my own country, sometimes it's not possible for all the interested stakeholders to be part of the conversation. So this is decentralizing, democratizing in a positive way. And my main fears are actually related to fake news and misinformation and the lack of or the restriction to freedom of expression. Those are my main fears, I would say.
All right. Well, thank you both for your time today and for imparting your wisdom upon all of us. For those of you in the audience, I thank you for your time as well and for attending. Please check out our website, americansecurityproject.org. Under the events tab, you'll see we've got a number of virtual events that are upcoming over the next few weeks. We encourage you to RSVP and attend until one day we can all see each other in person again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you.